The following is a preview of a Patreon exclusive. This episode contains references to real-life traumatic events that some might find upsetting. Listener discretion is advised.
Oh, actually, no. Joe's my favorite person now, because look at this. He finally pulled the trigger on the Obi-Wan Mythos sideshow figure.
Oh my gosh.
I am so
Another
proud of you,
sucker.
my friend.
Yeah.
No, it's worth every penny, man.
Oh,
It is worth every penny, and that's a lot of pennies.
it's a lot of pennies. Yeah, I don't have the funds for that. Okay. Let's talk about the show. Okay, before we get into the show. So we kind of joked that this was going to be a darker show. It's just the nature of the content, unfortunately. Like, I find this stuff pretty fascinating, and it doesn't really, I guess, bother me, but I did want to just say, give a quick warning that in the course of this conversation, we're going to be talking about real, like, mental health issues, some of the symptoms of some of the disorders that people go through. And then on top of that, we are going to reference, what Reva went through as a Padawan and being killed and murdered, or, attempted to be murdered there as part of Order 66. We're going to relate some of that to some very light talk about some of the mass shootings that happen here, unfortunately, in the U.S. and specifically in schools. And there's a reason why. And again, we're not going to get into the details of any of that stuff. It's really just going to be making a mention and trying to draw a parallel to that. It is going to stay focused primarily in Star Wars and talking about Reva through that lens. However, I just want to throw that out there in case anybody's super sensitive to that and don't want to listen to it. I totally get it, totally respect that. So it's
certainly not making light of anything that's going on, especially if anybody's listening that's been directly impacted or knows someone that's been impacted. It's definitely not to make any light of that. But there are very real, parallels with it, and the effects of that, are clearly evident with Reva, I think, in some ways. And so it's relevant. And so that's why we thought it would be good to kind of talk about it. And again, not go into a lot of detail on some of that stuff, but at least, again, make some of that really evident and give you something to think about.
Yep. Thought-provoking Star Wars talk. Okay, let's get this started. That's the rumor. So they've said. So I want to start with Reva, because I don't think we've really talked about this too much here. But I want to talk about, just kind of set the stage by talking about the impact of Order 66. Right? We all know and have spoken about the tragedy that is Order 66. There's tons of memes out there with that poor child, who I saw a picture was reunited with Hayden Christensen recently. Did you see this?
Yeah, I did.
Master Skywalker, that kid.
Mm-hmm.
They got together and took a snapshot or whatever. It was actually pretty sweet. But I mean, so we've all witnessed it. It is a horrible tragedy. It shocked a lot of people at the time, and I think it was very fitting for Anakin Skywalker / Vader, given what had just happened to him. So I think that's all pretty relevant. But if you think about it, from the perspective of Reva, she has been through a mass murder. Okay. On top of that, again, to kind of draw a quick parallel to a real world, right? We have these horrible mass shootings here in the U.S. that continue to happen. And if you think about from her perspective, that's exactly what she was at her school, right? She was at her school. She was in the midst of training, in the midst of studying, very similar. The only difference is that was also her home, right? I mean, that's kind of where they live. So not only was she being attacked and potentially killed in her school, but it was also her home. On top of that, when you look at who was teaching her and who she was being raised by, this was her family. So on top of the horrible thing that happened, you've got your own family members right, in Anakin Skywalker, at least, killing you. And then you've got like extended family members that are trying to kill you as well in the clone troopers, right? They've established this very close relationship. They've really turned the tides of this war at this point. It's on the brink of finally breaking. And, those relationships are there. There's all that trust that's been built. And to have suddenly everybody turn on you, dad and the uncles and all the other relatives suddenly trying to kill you, that in itself is probably a pretty traumatic kind of experience. And we're going to get into what some of that trauma could possibly be for Reva. But any thoughts on, I guess, the tragedy? I don't know if you've ever put much thought into that, but it does feel like it's pretty heavy when you really think about it from that perspective, I think.
Oh, it really is. I mean, when you think about, and it goes further than that, it's the people who you think are supposed to protect you and watch out for you, right? It's this, I mean, the sense of betrayal as well, and the fear that goes, because if you step back in your home or you in a school, it's just, it all comes rushing back. And even though Reva wasn't able to go home, you could just imagine all of that, it just doesn't make sense when you're, 10 years old or 12 years old, whatever she might have been.
Mm-hmm.
It just makes zero sense. And to have to figure that out on your own is just it's just cruel in some levels, right? And
Yeah.
when we hear the Grand Inquisitor say, "We found you in the gutter," it's not really hard to understand why, if he's being very literal, it's not hard to see why that's where she might have ended up, because if you have no one, one of the things we'll talk about tonight is that the way to not recover, but to kind of endure and to come out the other side, at least, somewhat healthy, is community and is support and things like that, right? Those are the things that really bring you and get you through those moments. And they have to continue for a longer period of time, not just the moment. And so when you're a child and you're left for dead, you're hiding with your friends and they're getting cold, and then you got to leave somehow. I mean, how the heck she even get off course on? It's just incredible, with the will to live, I think, in her in particular, and the strength that there is in just in that, but also just the spiral that she may have gone down is just incredible. Yeah. And that there's still something human inside of her is actually really quite impressive, even though it's been very deranged in some way based on the path that she's chosen to try to do all this.
Yeah, and you can probably credit. I mean, I'd like to credit the light that still sits there with her to her, maybe that instructor that died defending her. It could have been other family member, other Padawan. It could be other Jedi that were present. We don't know enough about. I mean, she's got a very interesting backstory that needs to be told, I think. In fact, I'm going to speculate here in just a little bit on what that story was like, and maybe some contributing factors that went into her eventual turn to the dark side. You were kind of touching on one of the first things I wanted to talk about here, which was people that have gone through I guess the survivors of these mass killings, and we're going to come back to real world just for a second here and just kind of talk about the psychology behind it all. But one of the things that comes about is a lot of the kids particularly are very resilient, believe it or not. I think the numbers vary. Unfortunately, there's a lot of research that's been done on this topic in the U.S. I mean, that's just sad to think about, but there's so many papers out there and so much psychoanalysis has gone into this. But for the sake of this discussion, one of the things that stood out was somewhere around 2/3 of the students seem to kind of bounce back, if you will. But to your point, that's done through a lot of, psychology and spending time with counselors and feeling like the community hasn't turned on them and that people are still good, right? There's a lot that goes into that. It's not just like next week I'm fine. There's a long process that has to happen for these kids to bounce back. Unfortunately, it's about 1/3 of them that still continue to suffer ongoing short-term and even long-term psychiatric disorders. And so what I want to kind of do is talk about some of the things that happen to people who don't have that support structure, who don't have that social support structure. Again, we talked about ongoing mental illness. They certainly suffer from post-traumatic stress syndrome, PTSD, depression, anxiety. There's substance abuse that happens there. And the one thing that was a really interesting factor in all of this is the closer, I know this is where, and I promise we'll get off the darker part, but the closer that a person, specifically a child in some of these reports I was reading about, is the closer they are to being hurt, right? Physically hurt or being close to someone who was physically hurt in some way, the more trauma they experience. So as an example, if you're 2 rooms over and something happened, you're likelier to bounce back than somebody who was actually in there and survived. So put this back to Reva, right? I mean, she
got everything up. She got everything and more. I mean,
and more.
The only thing she didn't do was unfortunately pass. I mean, that was really it.
So you would expect so given that, you would expect that she had a lot of trauma from this. I try to narrow these things down. Before I get into that, any thoughts on some of that? And like you said, like you brought up earlier, she just went through all of this and then has nothing, right? She has no community. She can't go back to the Jedi because they're gone. She can't go back to the clones because they've turned on her, right? And on top of that, she was taken from her family at a very young age. So she doesn't have a family to go to. So where does she go, right? She goes into the streets.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of what we're talking about has come from the APA, the American Psychological Association. So we tried to be somewhat informed about some of the things that we're pulling from this. So just as a point of reference. But yeah, I mean, you're right. Because when you talk about community, it's not necessarily your neighborhood. Like if you talk about a school, it's not necessarily your neighborhood. it's the people that you are with and in that environment, the teachers, the other parents, while the people in your neighborhood and everything are probably some of those same people, they're not all of it. It wouldn't be the same as if I was going and a group of policemen or policewomen were around me trying to comfort me. It's more of this prolonged support system that has to go on, and with people that have experienced it with you, because it's kind of like AA, right? Or NA. You go into these meetings because there's other people like you struggling with the same types of things, and you're sharing both your successes and as well as your struggles and the things that aren't going so well. So I mean, it's very similar when it comes to just that a bit of this talk therapy type of thing. But it's it just has to keep going. But you can also understand where Reva's coming from when she and Obi-Wan are having the talk through the steel door. I mean, if you just put that in perspective of you weren't there, why weren't you there? And like you said, no one else was there for her. And to know that someone survived and knew what had happened and they were in the area and they didn't do anything, has just got to be devastating all over again. And some of the things that, that we were reading through and some of this is that the threat of relapse is very, very real. And it can really happen at any time. And that's why it's so important for, support and all of that to continue on in a very long-term duration, not just in the moment after a month, you're cured, everything's fine. Like, no, these things really do stick with you. But you're right. Kids are very resilient in so many different ways.
Yeah.
But it unfortunately does matter depending on how close they were to the tragedy, both, emotionally, physically, but also in the event itself, and again, if you don't feel safe in your safe places, and I imagine there were a number of kids that happened with the Uvalde that happened, that even if they're not directly related, it's like, oh my God, that could happen to me.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it's just a reality of what we live in, unfortunately. But yeah, but with Reva though, you can see all of those things playing out over the course of her life too.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can understand why she would hold that against Obi-Wan in particular.
Well, and I think, and it's not an easy answer. I've seen a lot of people try to analyze Reva and talk about, what did she really want? And it seems like she wants Kenobi and she wants revenge on Vader and she wants to kill the Inquisitors and yada, yada. And yeah, you know what? It probably is all of those things, and that's okay. And that's kind of why I want to get into this, because if you think about it, she had such a traumatic experience that she's not right. And I think it shifts, right? She's just angry. She's lashing out. She's latching on to different people to attack and kill till we get to the final point at the very end where she's like, I don't care who that kid is. He's got some association to these people that have just sat there idle and knew this was happening, allowed it to happen, and I'm going to get my revenge one way or the other, right?
And we'll then the word she used was justice, right? And so you can see how that it can be a bit perverted, from where what you really are trying to accomplish, what you think is right or wrong, and what you're trying to do about it. You're trying to make some sort of change so it doesn't happen again. So your intentions aren't necessarily evil or wrong or anything like that, but definitely how you go about doing it, you start to get more and more desperate if you're not getting the type of attention and support that you need to get you through it.
So let's talk about there's a lot of syndromes and disorders out there, unfortunately. I try to narrow this down based on some of the key words and just said these are potential things. I mean, we don't know this, of course, but this is all purely speculation. But just some of these things that kind of jumped out at me is if she, if Reva was real, and given what we've experienced and seen firsthand in the shows and what things that she said, what potentially could she be diagnosed with, right? The one that always jumped to the front was this thing called complex PTSD syndrome. So it's kind of like the next level of PTSD. A lot of these are all they're kind of offshoots or off products of them, right? You may get one and you suddenly develop another. They're all kind of in that same family, but they have some very unique and distinct kind of symptoms in them. But for this one, I think the one that said, and I'm not going to go through every symptom of this, but one of the ones was memories of trauma may trigger powerful emotions, right? We saw that at the very end of the episode, especially when she was looking at Luke Skywalker and she was kind of hallucinating and seeing that kind of seeing herself there at that moment.
Same with Vader was approaching her when she was on her knees as well. Yeah.
Yeah. She suddenly lapsed, flashed back directly into that time when he tried to kill her. There's another one where it was called the effect emotion dysregulation, which is the inability to manage the intensity and duration of negative emotions such as fear, sadness, or anger. And that's probably true of every Sith, right? That's kind of part of their DNA. But yeah, so the effects of prolonged negative emotion may be physically, emotionally, and behaviorally intense. And I think we see this, right? When you think about when we saw that first episode and she comes in hot with the people that are standing there, right? I'm talking when they're on Tatooine, and she
Right.
just lobs that woman's hand off, like for no reason, really. I mean, we get she was kind of mouthing off, but it was so intense, it was so severe, it was so over the top. Part of it is probably something, psychological. Maybe not this. It could be this, right? I think it kind of lines up.
Yeah.
But we're going to get into something else a little bit later around the dark side and I mean, that's kind of the X factor in all this. But we'll get into the discussion around the dark side, but it's specifically about using some of that fear and intimidation. And we see Vader use this. All the Sith really kind of use this, right? Vader uses it. Kylo Ren uses it. But that could be another factor that went into why she just kind of fired off on that lady and just lobbed her hand off like no big deal to make a statement.
Right. And for some people, it's about taking they view it as kind of taking their power back, right? If they can lash out and they can get angry and they could do something, it gives them the feeling of some sort of control, right? Of trying to wrestle it back. Even after, 10 years, Reva is still struggling with just feeling like she has control over things because she knows the things that she wants to accomplish. But she also wants to take out her anger and stuff on Jedi in particular as well. So she's kind of leading this double life of what she's really getting a benefit out of it by hunting Jedi, but also trying to get closer to Vader to get revenge on him as well. But I mean, you can just feel that sense of she feels powerless a lot of the times, and she's constantly being put down by the Grand Inquisitor and by Fifth Brother. So any opportunity she has to assert herself, she's going to, and that tends to be a bit more extreme at times. Actually, we saw this a bit with Anakin too. I mean, a lot of things parallel with Anakin here of, his outbursts as well, based on how he viewed the world and what was going on around him. Very different circumstances in some ways, but some similarities.
So the interesting thing about complex PTSD syndrome, there was a lot of articles that were really, there were some that were specific around children that had survived mass shootings, but there were a lot of articles around veterans and people that had come back from military war who had been in war. And the next three kind of specifically talk to those, and I'll just quickly touch on them. The altered ability to form interpersonal relationships. I mean, that's, kind of a given. We see her personality. She's not, establishing good relationship with anyone, really.
Yeah, doesn't have any relationships, really.
No. And then there's the self-destructive behavior. If you think about it, her joining the Inquisitorius is probably a form of self-destructive behavior, right? I mean, she's joining the bad guys.
The dark side is basically a drug for substance abuse, right? I mean, you could equate the same way.
Yep. And then the other one, the one that really stood out was, and this is a direct quote, feelings of enduring revenge, right? And that's like Reva to a T. We see that. I mean, it's in the things that she says and the things that she does. I definitely, she calls it justice. We look at it as revenge. I think it's 100% revenge. And it's revenge, again, like we said earlier, about against anyone, really. It's kind of whoever she can pick up for all the reasons we've talked about, including the one you just mentioned here about control, having some kind of level of control over her life again.
Right. But it's very much a point of view thing. I mean, that sounds very cliche, but it really is, right? It's so difficult to really put ourselves and to have that empathy for someone if we haven't been in such an extreme situation, in such an extreme form of trauma that, to say that they're wrong in doing what they're doing. I think you have to step back and remember that really they're just trying to cope. I mean, at the end of the day, that's really what they're trying to do. They're just trying to cope. Like Reva is just trying to cope with everything that's happened, because one of the things we're about to get into this, I think, is where we see this at the very end is survivor's guilt, right?
Yeah.
And that type of thing really does, man, it can really weigh on you that, why was I spared, but everyone around me wasn't?
Yeah. And that is the next one, is the next syndrome, which is survivor's guilt syndrome. And I think I think most people are probably familiar with this one. I think you did a good job of kind of summing that one up. A lot of the same symptoms that are kind of from the complex PTSD as well, but emotions such as sadness, anger, denial, fear, and shame. When you say sadness, anger, denial, fear, and shame, what do you think of in Star Wars? The dark side, right? So, I mean, all of these are just, one feeds the other in a lot of ways, and back and forth. So, and there's other stuff in here like nightmares, insomnia. Of course, we didn't really get to see any of that stuff. Difficulty with relationships and emotional outbursts. I think all that kind of fits the bill there.
Right. And there's a difference between guilt and shame, right? So guilt is more temporary. Shame is permanent. and it has a much more fixated place on you. And those are the ones that are really, the shame is more a depiction of who you are internally. And that is very, very difficult. Once that takes root, that is very, very difficult to move past and get over.
Mm-hmm. So the next one that I had on here, and it's kind of the third and last one really that I want to talk about, was because I mentioned this one, and there's certain symptoms that fit into this, and I was kidding up front.
The more on this one, I think kind of the less I've kind of gravitated into this one, but I see why there's connections to it though.
Yeah, and it's not so much this one's not so much a byproduct necessarily of Order 66. I put this one in here because we're really kind of trying to get in the head of Reva. If you fast forward to where she is at the beginning of the show, on some levels, I think there is some Stockholm Syndrome going on here, right?
I agree
And
with
this
that.
is, this syndrome kind of develops from abusive relationships, whether it's physically or emotionally. A lot of times we are quick to say, oh, this happens to people that are being held captive or being held against their will, by a foreign country or some other foreign oppositional force. And it can really exist in a household, depending on the relationships with parents and children or other relatives, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact that she is now part of this brotherhood, and they've all signed up to this, whether they wanted to or not, right? We know that the Inquisitors, some of them volunteered, some of them didn't. I assume she just volunteered for this because of all the reasons we talked about and wanting to get revenge on Vader and all that. But this one is interesting because they do have reoccurring flashbacks to the trauma, so that is a symptom of it. They have a lack of feeling, fear, helplessness, hopelessness, aggression, depression, guilt, and that numbness, right? To be able to go in, again, it's a lot of this is dark side. We'll come back. We're going to talk about the dark side here in a little bit, but if she is going through this, right, that behavior becomes normalized for her, right? Going off and just cutting off somebody's hand, although it might have been shocking to the fifth brother, for her, she's probably normalized this already, and it's not a big deal. There's billions of people out there in the galaxy, so what's one hand less, right? Just kind of desensitized to a lot of that stuff. And then the anxiety, irritability, cautiousness, estrangement. I think those are all probably very symptomatic of Reva as well. And then some victims kind of feed off the high of survivability of their captors or tormentors. So once they have found a way to live within the system, and they know what makes their captors or their aggressors happy and keeps them alive, they start to gain a psychological high from that, and so they want more and more of that because they know their life is in danger at all times. At any moment, that person could kill them, or that group could kill them. So they start to relish in this idea of, well, what can I do now? What can I do next to buy myself another day, right? Or to have myself look in a positive light, or have them have favor with me, even if it's just for one more day or 2 more hours, and then I'll figure it out after that. They constantly build on that. And if you think about the Inquisitors and you think about the Sith, that's exactly what they're doing. I mean, they are living constant. The Master and Apprentice are more the Master is in constant fear and living that guy is going to kill, that other person's going to kill them at some point. And so they kind of have this weird, awkward, sometimes passive aggressive, sometimes aggressive relationship where they're just trying to figure out how to keep the other one at arm's length and appease, just so that they can continue to live for another day, right? So I think all of that does fit into that to that. But what are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about Vader in particular, one of the things I've thought a lot about really over the last few years is that it's really difficult to have physical safety unless you have psychological safety. And I think when you look at the Inquisitors in general, and anybody in the dark side, and anybody that's really reporting to Vader, your physical safety is constantly, on the table. Yep. It's always at risk in some way. And so by her appeasing to Vader's positive side, even going over the head of the Grand Inquisitor, it's satisfying that need for some sort of psychological safety, that the Grand Inquisitor can't touch me if I'm satisfying the needs of Lord Vader.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so it very much has its roots in Stockholm Syndrome as well. And it may be a slightly different way, but it's still fundamentally there, that she is trying to make sure that she feels safe so that she is safe. And you start to be a little bit, or in Reva's case, she tends to be a bit more bold, right? Because again, she feels like these other clowns, they can't give me the safety and the security that I'm looking for. Only one person can do it. And I'm willing to roll the dice that and get his wrath if I end up failing, because I have this confidence in me that I'm not going to fail, because I also know I want him later. And so it's a really weird, vicious cycle with her. It's a really interesting way of doing it. And you don't see this kind of thing very often, except maybe in the movies. At least I'm not aware of it. But anyway, yeah, the whole idea of psychological safety, though, is something that really can't be overstated, because really without that, you really can't feel secure in anything, at least not fundamentally secure and like daily and grounded in what is real. And that, okay, my safety is really real. It's not a delusion. It's not just another post-traumatic, event.
Yeah.
It's real.
Yeah, and there's a lot of insecurity here with Reva, as with Vader and a number of other folks as well.
Right.
So I guess the question then is, you go back to Reva. She somehow survives, or well, we know how she survives, but she survives Order 66 and left for dead, and she has a choice. I mean, you could argue that she didn't, but I think she did at some point, right? And maybe she was too young, too naive to make the right decision. She was fueled by emotion, fueled by anger, fueled by revenge. And so she naturally did things that kind of led her on a path to get into this, dark side, the Inquisitors and all that, right?
Right.
But of all the things, I think some people have taken issue with, like, why would she go to the group, that's out there trying to kill Jedi and falling in line with the one person that killed all of her family, right? People are having a really hard time with that. And one of the things that I thought was, if you're a force sensitive person and something like this happened, again, we're talking about the unreal world here at this point. But if you're a force sensitive person, you don't really kind of fit in everywhere else, right?
Right.
I can see where,
Especially if you feel like you're hunted all the time.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So rather than be hunted, why don't you do the hunting? Now, any normal, rational person probably wouldn't go down that path. But again, for all the stuff that we just explained, in her mind, this is kind of like, well, I'm not on this side, so maybe I will join the bad guys. And, it could be self-serving in that she wants to get revenge on Vader. I think that's that, and the fact that she's just looking for some level of security, some level of safety. Those are not mutually exclusive, right? They can both exist with Reva.
Right. And look at Tala. So what did Tala do? Tala was already in, but she decided to stay in, even though she had a fundamental shift in her beliefs came out, right? And she recognized the evil that was the Empire, but she still made a decision because she felt she could do more from inside than outside.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that can't be overlooked, because when you look at the might and the power and the influence and the sheer terror that the Empire put on the galaxy, it's not hard to see why you would not want to speak up. What happens when people speak up? There's not enough people to speak up, right? And that's why the rebellion took so long to actually get a foothold and to actually do something. And I'm really curious how Andor addresses some of this. If we get a bit more of a look at it starting to build momentum to where we see it, as we get closer to a Rogue One, where it's on the cusp of actually becoming an organized, military, force. But it's the same idea, though, is that I can probably do more from the inside than I can just by, a skirmish here or skirmish there, or sabotaging this or sabotaging that. And it can be, now I think what Reva was doing and Tala they're not the same, clearly.
Sure, right.
But the idea is still is similar, right, of how you would do that. And again, with her abilities, with Reva's abilities, yes, she could definitely, do the path stuff, and she could, help people. But again, this idea of justice, and I don't even call it revenge, because I really do think that she views it as justice.
Mm-hmm.
I need to do this for all of the people that were around me that couldn't defend themselves, and I couldn't defend them either. I couldn't even defend my own self. So I have to be able to do this, and the best way to do it is from within and get closer to the one who actually needs to be taken out.
Yeah, there's if and not to be funny about this, but if we had to strip everything away that we just talked about in terms of why going to the Sith would be her option. If you go back to the line from Palpatine, where he says the Sith and Jedi are similar in almost every way, there are plenty of examples where we could. I think the former host had done a show, something on this topic at one point, but kind of just talking about how they really are similar, right, in a lot of ways. And we're not going to get into that, but again, they're probably similar enough for somebody like Reva to go, okay, well, I'll just go. The light side didn't work out for me, so let me join the dark side. There's also the quote from The Dark Knight Returns, the comic book, or the movie, if you saw the movie, which says, you either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. So, and again, we're talking about why did she become the bad person here? Go ahead.
And I'm so glad you bring that one up, because it's not that, and this is the thing, I don't think she intended to be evil or bad or do bad things. And I think that's what Batman was saying in the movie, was that it's not that you willfully do this, you go that way. It's just you've done it for so long, it's difficult for you to tell which side of the line you're on.
Yeah.
Right. And I know that's not completely what he was trying to say in that scene, but it's one of the ways that I think is fair to interpret it as well. Because when you're flirting with this line and you're on this line of really chaos versus order, even if you intend to bring order to things in a fair and just kind of way, well, we could use that lightly, I guess, but you are, at some point, you're going to keep making concessions. And you'll keep making exceptions, and it's going to chip away, and the dark side feeds on that thing.
Yeah.
It just feeds on it. And you are going to lose that fight, especially if you don't have the support around you. And it wasn't until Obi-Wan comes around that Reva even thought that it was an option. I don't know how much actually she, attention she gave to it or thought she put into it, but to her, it wasn't even an option because there's no one. It's just her. And so, as far as she knows, I'm the only one carrying the light around here. But with her, it's some very skewed version of that light.
The last thing on, as far as kind of the psychology of all this, before we get into her potential backstory.
Maybe that's what we should have named this episode, is The Psychology of Reva.
Yeah, Reva. Yeah. But the other...
Hey everyone, it's Jonesy. We hope you've enjoyed this preview of the Patreon episode. If you'd like to listen to the episode in full, we invite you to head over to cantinacast.com/Patreon. Access to this episode begins at the $2 After Dark tier. If you're interested in joining a future Patreon episode, we encourage you to check out our Now Part of the Tribe and Delusions of Grandeur tiers. You can find all the details at cantinacast.com/Patreon. On behalf of Albert and myself, thank you all for your continued support, and may the Force be with you.